Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today I have a tutorial on how I painted this Studio Ghibli scene. This is quite a lengthy video because I went into quite a bit of detail as to how I painted this scene from start to finish. All the materials that I used will be in the description box below, so please check that out. I've broken my process into 4 simple steps, so let's just start with the first step, which is sketching out the scene. So the purpose of this is to just get an idea of what the composition of the scene looks like on your paper or canvas. So you just want to use a HB pencil, something nice and light, and just lightly sketch in where everything is. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, but the point of it is to make sure that everything that you want to be in the frame is able to make it into the picture. So it's important just to get the proportions of things right. And it's better to make any mistakes in this stage because it's much easier to fix it up than it is when you actually start painting and laying in the colors. I would say the most important part in this step is to get the perspective of the house correct. I think this is the part that needs to be most accurate compared to everything else. I also like to use a kneadable eraser just to lighten some of the lines. Once you've finished sketching out the scene, you can move on to step 2, which is blocking in. The purpose of this step is just to get the values correct. I'm going to start with the color of the sky. So on my palette I have primary cyan and white, and I'm just mixing a nice sky blue color and just blocking in the color of the sky here. And afterwards I have some primary yellow and I want to mix a nice green color. So using the same brush, I'm just going to mix some yellow with the blue that I have on my brush, and that'll give me a nice green. And I'm just blocking in the color of the hills here. And the color that we're aiming to achieve is the undertone. So in the picture it looks quite light overall, but we want to create a undertone which is a little bit darker, because as we go on we will be layering the highlights and lighter colors on top. So we just want to start with a darker color on the bottom. And when I'm blocking in, I want to make sure that I'm not just laying one color. So I want to put in different variations of the green. Some parts have a little more yellow in it and some parts have a little more blue. Now after I've done that part of the hill, I'm going to do the background hill, and I'm using the color Prussian blue and I'm mixing that with yellow to get a dark green. If you don't have Prussian blue, you can always just use another blue such as phthalo blue, or you can use primary cyan and just mix it with a little bit of black, and that'll give you a nice dark blue. So I'm just blocking in the hills with this color and just making sure to get a little bit of variation. So some parts are a little bit darker, some are a little bit lighter. We just want to get the general gist of what it looks like, just placing in the values here. So after I've done that, I want to move on to the foreground and I want to paint in the ground. So I'm using burnt umber and I mixed it with a little bit of white. So you can see here when I've laid in the color, I thought it was a little bit gray. So now I use some raw sienna. You can use raw sienna or yellow ochre, they're both very similar. So I'm put in some raw sienna and I mixed that with white, but I thought it was a little bit too yellow. And now what I've done is I've mixed the burnt umber mixture with my raw sienna mixture, and then I feel like I've achieved a more accurate color. So now I'm just laying that in, and it's good to have variation here as well. So I'm just blocking in the foreground here, and now I want to place in the path. So this is quite a light color, so I'm just blocking it in, and I just want to get the gist of things here. Once we've blocked in the painting, we can move on to step 3, which I call sculpting. And what this means is I'm not trying to put in all the details of the painting. I'm just trying to sculpt out what it looks like so that when I look at it from afar, I can tell what it is, but it's not yet complete, or it doesn't have all the details it needs. So I'm starting with the mountains here, and my approach to mountains is I look at it from 2 different views. So on one side you have the light hitting it, and on the other side you have the shadow. So those are the two faces of the mountain, and I always start with the darker side, so I start with the shadows. And I'm picking out the darker shadow here, which I've just used the colors Prussian blue mixed with a little bit of white. And it looks a little bit funny at first, but what I'm doing is I'm just imitating what I see in the picture, and it's just trying to lay in the contours of the mountain. So I'm just laying in the darker colors here, and that's basically what I'm doing the whole time. So I'm just gonna lay in the darker shadow on this side. If this is a little bit unclear or confusing, or you'd like me to do a more in-depth tutorial on how I paint mountains, just let me know in the comments below, and I'd be more than happy to make a more in-depth tutorial on how I do mountains. So once I've put in the contours, then I mix a lighter blue, so I just mix a little bit more white into the blue, and I'm just sort of filling in the details in between. So that side of the mountain face is a little bit darker, so I'm just sort of putting in the colors there and making sure to leave the other side white, so that way you can see how the mountain is 3D, because you're seeing where the light hits it and where there is shadow. Now I'm going to add in the highlights on the other side, so I'm just taking pure white and I'm just highlighting those areas where the light is hitting. So I think this step really helps to define the mountain, as you can see how the contours help to show that there is depth to it. And don't worry too much if you think the mountain doesn't quite look like a mountain at this stage, because we will come back later to fine tune the details, but for now we just want to get in the gist of what it should look like. So at this stage I'm quite happy with how it looks, so I'm just going to leave it and move on to the next element, which is the clouds underneath. And I made an in-depth tutorial on how I paint Studio Ghibli style clouds, so feel free to refer to that, because in this video I think I'll just speed up this part because it's really the same process as what I had explained in the other video, where I'm basically just laying in the shadow colors first, and then I add in the highlights, and then I'm just contouring around that. So I'll just speed up this part because the video is already quite lengthy. So moving on to the hills underneath, I'm using yellow mixed with primary cyan to get a nice light green color. And then I'm going to start by highlighting areas of the mountain. So because the mountain in the background is quite dark, in order to sculpt out the shape of it, I want to start with the highlights. So I mix in some white as well, and then we just want to build out where the crevices and the hills are. So just using the light green to indicate some highlights. Now I wanted to mix a darker green, so I'm using Viridian green here, but if you don't have that color, you can always just continue using the colors that you do have. So you can just use Prussian blue, or you can use phthalo blue and just mix it with a little bit of black so it's a little bit darker, and then mix that with yellow so you get a darkish kind of green. And now that we've done the highlights, we want to move on to the shadows. So that's the fastest way that I find to be able to define something, is you can either start with the highlights and then move on to the shadows, or you start with the shadows and move on to the highlights, and that really just defines the overall image already. So now I'm just layering in the shadow colors here. And now going back to the highlights, I want to mix a lot of white and yellow into the green mixture that I have, and I want to start sculpting out more of the hills. So I want to add some more highlights to it. So here I am just adding highlights in between all the shadows that I've put, and this just helps to define the hills further. In the image, I can also see that there's hints of blue in the hill, so I'm using primary cyan and I'm mixing in just the tiniest bit of yellow so that it's still overall a blue color, and I'm just layering that in as well. And I think the hints of blue really help to make it pop a little more and just gives the painting some more life overall, so that it's not just green. At this stage, I'm happy with how the background hills look, so I'm going to move on to the foreground here. So I'm just using yellow and I'm mixing it with white, so I get a nice light yellow, but it's also got a little hint of primary cyan in it, and that way I've just got a light green. And I want to start by highlighting the hills in the foreground. So I'm just adding highlights to the highest parts of the hill, and I'm always referring to the image at hand to help me determine where I should lay in these highlights. So remember at the start when we were blocking in, we made sure that the color we were laying in was a darker color, so we were laying in a darker undertone, because throughout the next stage we're going to be highlighting on top of the hill, and that is what makes it look three-dimensional. Now I'm going to use a little bit of black and I'm going to mix that with yellow. And black mixed with yellow actually makes a nice olive green color. You just want to use the tiniest hint of black, and you mostly want yellow here, so it's a yellowish olive green. And I'm going to use that color and just layer it in as well, because I can see in the image that there are some olive green colors. Next, I'm moving on to defining the path. So I'm using burnt umber and I'm just adding in the shadows here. So when I look at the path, I can see that it's sort of sinking in between the hills. So our aim is to create shadow around the sides so as to show that the path is sort of sinking in. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just sort of outlining it around here with burnt umber. If you want the paint to be a little darker, I like to mix it with a little bit of black as well. And then after I have that, I'm going to mix a lighter color. So I'm still using burnt umber, but I'm just mixing with some white. And I want to lay that next to the shadow we just made, because we just want to soften out the edges and blend it into the path. After the path, I decided to fill in the area where there's a fence, and behind the fence there is a pile of rocks. So I'm just using Prussian blue, mixing it with a little bit of black and white so it gives a bluish black, and I just want to lay in that color there, so just filling in that space there. Once that's all filled in, I want to just touch up the front and put some grass in there. So I'm just mixing yellow with primary cyan to get a nice green color, and then I just want to lay that in front of the grey we just put in, and that's just to show that there is some grass in front of it. Now we can put in the fence, and I'm just using black paint and just carefully using a round brush, or you can use a liner brush, and just painting in the fence. So it doesn't have to be perfect because the fence is a little bit crooked, so it's good if it's not perfect. It gives it more of a sort of old feel to it. Now moving on to the ground, I mixed raw sienna with white to get a nice light color, and you can also mix in a little bit of burnt umber to that. And then what I'm doing is I'm just sculpting out the highlights in the ground. So when I look at this, I can see that the path is kind of splitting outwards towards us, which is why I'm putting in strokes that sort of go in different directions. So it's as though the path is kind of splitting out. And then after I've put in the highlights, in between I want to put in some darker color. So I'm just using raw sienna with a little less white, and I'm just filling in that. So what I want to do here is I just want to lay in the base color, and I just want to create some variation in the ground. So I want different tones in it, because afterwards I will lay in the shadows on top or the cracks in the ground, but underneath I want to make sure that there's quite a bit of variety, so it creates more interest. And now I'm using burnt umber, and I'm starting to lay in where the shadows are. Once I'm happy with how the ground looks, I'll just leave it, and I'm going to move on to the house. Now this step could actually be part of step 2, blocking in, but I've just left it to now, but you could have done it earlier as well. So here I am blocking in the house, and I just want to get the values right. So I want to make sure that the front of the house is a lighter color, so I'm using burnt umber mixed with a lot of white, and it just creates a creamish kind of color, and you can mix in some raw sienna as well. And I'm just filling in the front of the house, and then at this point I realized that I think my line work was a little bit dark, so I'm just going in with my kneadable razor and just lifting off a little bit of the pencil work here, because in some areas where, for example, the cloud and the roof of the house meet, the color of the paint is a little lighter, so it might not cover the lines if they are a bit too dark. So I just made sure to lighten the line work just in case that the paint was too sheer to cover it up. And then I just want to block in some more, so I'm just putting in the door here, and then afterwards I'm going to do the side of the house. So I'm using raw sienna, and I'm making sure that this shade is a lot darker than what the front of the house is, because this part is more in shadow. So I'm just blocking that in. For the roof of the house, I'm using cadmium red and just mixing it with some white, so it's a light red or a sort of palish pinkish color, and mixing in a little bit of raw sienna as well and a bit of raw umber, so it's kind of a warm earthy red, and then I'm just blocking in the color of the roof. Once I'm happy with how the house looks, I'm going to move on to step 4, which is detailing. So this step is where you really fine tune everything. So going back to the mountains, I'm going to start fine tuning how the mountains look so that it really looks defined, and to do that I'm using a darker blue, so I'm using Prussian blue but mixed with a little less white than last time, and I'm just going in and defining the shadows. This step can take a little bit of time, so just be patient with it. Overall, this painting actually took me over 5 hours to complete. I know in the video it looks as though I'm doing it very quickly, but I'm putting it sometimes at 2000 times speed. So just remember that it does take time to add details to it, but if you do take your time and you add details to it, it really will give the painting a lot more life. So just take your time when it comes to this stage. At this point, I'm happy with how the mountains look, and now I want to move on to the clouds. So I'm going to use just pure white, and I'm just highlighting the cloud so that it really looks quite fluffy. So I'm just using white and I'm just layering in where the light will hit the clouds. And I also like to use a dry brushing technique here. So what I do is I'll use the white paint and I'll scruff it onto the clouds, and when there's almost no paint left on the brush, I'll use it to scruff around the edges of the clouds, and what that does is it creates kind of a misty look, so you can scruff it a little over the mountains and a little bit over the hills underneath, so it looks as though there's fog around the clouds. Now I want to add more details to the background hills. So I'm just mixing a really light green color here, mixing a lot of white into it, and I want to put in some highlights, and this will really make the hills start to pop out. So I'm just adding in highlights to the part where the light is hitting it, and you can see that it's starting to really define where the hills are. And I also want to add in some darker areas as well. So I'm mixing yellow with some more blue, and I'm also filling in areas of that so that there's more variety. I don't want to just have one shade of green in there. I want to have different shades of green and have a little bit of blue as well. And I'm also going to use some raw sienna mixed with white and add that in as well, because I can see that there's hints of that color in the image. I think when you get to the detailing stage of a painting, it's really up to you how far you want to take it. So you can spend a lot of time on it and you can make it very detailed, or you can just sort of decide when you want to stop, and when you think that that's enough detail, So I think for me, when I sort of take a look at it and I think that it looks okay, that there's no need to add any more details, then I'll usually just leave it there. But there really is no hard and fast rule to how far you should go. So now I'm just going to clean up the edges around where the clouds meets the hill, and I'm just using some white and using dry brushing technique to just scruff around the edges so that it blends together better. Moving on to the hills in the front, I'm just mixing green with blue and yellow, and I'm going to start putting in some details here. So I want to start with the grass on the hill. Now I'm using light yellow and I'm just indicating some highlights, or it could be flowers, but this just helps to give more depth to the hills. At this stage, I want to start working on the path again. So I really want to carve that path, and just to show that it's sort of sinking in between the hills. So to do that, I'm using burnt umber mixed with a little bit of black to create a nice dark shadow, and I'm just outlining the shadows on the edge here. Then I'm using a lighter color and I'm blending that into the path. Now I can also see that there are rocks on this hill, so in order to create that, I'm just mixing grey, just using black and white, and I'm just gonna paint in some rocks. So once I paint in the rocks, then I'll put in the highlights, and in order to put in the highlights, I just mix more white into it, and I just highlight the side that's hitting the light, so that's the right side. Now I want to use olive green again, so just using yellow mixed with a little bit of black, and using that olive green I'm going to create some more shadows and just create some more hills on this hill in the front. There's also a path that's leading off the side of the main path, so I'm trying to build that in at the moment, and I'm just using raw sienna mixed with white and a little bit of burnt umber, and I'm just carving out that path there while also putting more details into the main path. I'm really happy with how the hills look. I can see that there's a lot of depth to it, and I can see the little details as well, such as the rocks there. So I'm gonna leave that, and now moving on to the ground. So in order to build this up, I'm just using raw sienna mixed with white, and I'm kind of just putting in highlights again. So I always work in layers. So in the first layer we just blocked it in, and in the second layer when we were sculpting it out, we were sort of just putting in the gist of what the path looks like. And now in this final step, I'm just putting in more highlights here and there, and just using raw sienna with a little bit of burnt umber sometimes, and just putting in the highlights on the floor. And because it's like a dirt path, you want to put in just lots of brush strokes in there, and then when it's all sort of together, it creates the illusion of it being like a dirt path. To create more variety in the floor, now I'm using burnt umber mixed with white. And when I paint, usually I'll just test out the color. So in the first instance, I realized that it was a little bit too light, so I added some more burnt umber. Then I realized it still looked a little too light on the page, so I added some more burnt umber. And then I just went around and added in that shade in there, just to give it more dimension as well, so it doesn't just look like one color. And then now for the last step, I'm using just burnt umber mixed with a little bit of black, so it's dark, and I really want to carve out the cracks in the road here. now I'm adding in highlights again, and that really is the final step for the ground. I also realized that I didn't get to film the fence on the side and the rocks there because my camera had some issues at this point. But basically what I did there was, in order to create the illusion of there being a pile of rocks there, you just have to paint in a few rocks at the top of the pile, so make sure those look defined. Then, in order to make it look like it's stacked on top of rocks, you just put in different brush strokes that show the different contours of rocks, and you're just kind of indicating that there are rocks there. And then with the fence, I just highlighted the area where the light was hitting, so I highlighted the right side and the top side of the fence, and that made it look more 3D. And now I'm just going in and putting in some grass here and just putting in a little bit more detail. Now we're on to the last part of the painting, which is the house. Also at this point it was starting to get dark, so the lighting gets a little bit worse, but I was trying very hard to finish this painting in one day, which is why the lighting got very bad towards the end, but I hope you're still able to see clearly what I'm doing. So firstly I'm just putting in the shadows. So here I'm using a dark color. You can either use black mixed with white to create grey, or I think I also used raw umber, but if you don't have that color you can always just use black. And so after I put in the shadow, now I'm just going to work on this side of the house. So what I started off with was I try to indicate the bricks. So I'm just using raw umber mixed with burnt umber and a little bit of black, and I try to indicate that there were bricks there. But actually at this point I got a little bit stuck with the painting because I felt like I couldn't achieve what I wanted, so I actually just ended up leaving that side of the wall and I moved on to the other side. So that's a good tip for when you're painting. If you get stuck on one element, maybe just leave it and move on to something else, and then when you come back later it'll start to click together for you. So now I'm working on the doorway here, and I just outlined it carefully. So this stage you want to work very carefully because you're up to the detailing stage. I also painted in the windows, and then I moved on to painting in the bricks on the front side of the house. So I'm just mixing raw sienna mixed with white, and I'm just indicating bricks. Now I'm carefully outlining the doorway here, and I'm just using black paint. So I'm outlining the doorway, and I'm also outlining the side of the house, and I also do the roof as well. Now I want to create some highlights, so I'm just using white and I'm just filling in between the bricks. After the highlights I create some shadows under the bricks, so I'm just using black, or you can use raw umber. Now I'm working on the roof of the house, and I'm just using green, and I'm layering in some green on the roof just to show that there's some, it could either be moss that's growing on the roof, but I can see that there's a little bit of green in the image, so I'm layering that on, and then I'm layering on a little bit of grey, and then I move on to working on the chimney. And for the chimney, I'm using raw sienna mixed with white, so that's the lighter side of the chimney. Then for the shadow side, I'm using raw sienna with a little bit of burnt umber, and then I'm painting in the shadows, and then afterwards I start to outline the chimney with black paint. And I'm using cadmium red again for the roof and just mixing it with white, and I just want to fix up some of the area around the chimney. And I also mix in a little bit of the raw sienna so that it gives it more of an earthy color, and I'm just filling in around the chimney where there are gaps. Then just to add details to the roof and give it more depth and to make the tiles appear as though they're there, I'm just using a liner brush, and I'm just indicating that there are tiles on the roof. Now that I painted the roof and the other side of the house, I felt more confident coming back to this side of the house, and I felt like I could see what it should look like. So I started painting in the bricks again, and I'm using a darker color. I'm using burnt umber, and I'm just painting in that, and then using a little bit of blue as well. So I used Prussian blue here, and I put in a little bit of that as well. Then I added some highlights, and I could really see that this is the look I was trying to go for the first time. And then I moved on to painting in the windows on this side. So I'm using Prussian blue mixed with a little bit of black so that it's a more bluish grey, and then I lightened it a bit and just filled in the window here and made sure to put in a lighter side as well so that I can blend it together and it looks like there's some more dimension to the window. Now for the final touches, I'm just painting in a fence next to the house, and I'm just painting in that with black at first, then I'll add in the highlights next to it so that it looks more 3D, and I'm just adding a little bit of detail behind it as well, so just defining the grass there. And then once I finish that fence, I am pretty much finished with the whole painting. I know this was a really lengthy video. I think all in all the footage that I had was about 5 hours, and I've condensed it into under an hour. So do take your time if you follow this tutorial, because it did take me a while to paint this. So take your time when you're painting it. I really hope that you found this video helpful, and if you do decide to paint it, I would love to see what you did. If you have any suggestions or comments for how this video was, please leave it in the comments below, and I would love to know what you think. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I hope I will see you in the next one. Stay safe. Bye bye.